What if the Bangles were influenced by the new wave of British heavy metal? Find out on this week's What If, How, When, Why. Hello, my name is Morgan Brown, and for the last few months I've been making a series of videos that I call What If videos. The idea of these is that each week I take a different popular song and imagine an alternative universe in which a different set of circumstances or a decision that someone's made caused that song to come out completely different from the version that we know and love. I then take the original lead vocal of that song and record a new backing track to it using just GarageBand and whatever instruments I have to hand in order to try and bring this alternative version of the song to life. So in keeping with my wintry theme for December, this week I picked the Bangles version of Simon and Garfunkel's Hazy Shade of Winter. I tried to reimagine that as a new wave of British heavy metal track. So if you haven't had a chance to listen to that yet, here's a little taster.
Look around, it's the ground, and the sky is a hazy shade of winter. We are the Salvation Army band. Down by the side is bound to be a better ride than what you got planned. Carry you up in your hand. Look around, it's the ground, and the sky is a hazy shade of winter. Hang on to your hopes, my friend. That's the easy thing to say, but if your hopes should pass away, simply pretend that you can build them again.
With deciding to do some wintry themed songs, I was very happy to have an opportunity to take a look at Hazy Shade of Winter because it's a great song. I've been a long time fan of Simon and Garfunkel. The Bookends album that this song's from is an absolute classic, but the Bangles version was the first version I ever heard, and so that's always stuck in my mind. Also, there's a notable punk version by Snuff from the Flibbity Dibbity Dob EP, which is well worth checking out if you like your high-speed melodic punk. So a song that works in multiple different settings. But as I say, the first version I ever heard was by the Bangles. So when I was looking for ideas for winter songs to cover, and this came up on a list of winter songs, I was very happy to have an excuse to talk about the Bangles for a bit, because I think they're an important band and one that is quite underrated in the grand scheme of things, really, as well. And they were very successful for a good few years back there in the 80s. But I think now when people talk about pioneering all-female rock and pop bands, they'll look back to the Runaways and they'll look back to the Go-Go's, and quite often they'll just overlook the Bangles a little bit, which I think is a shame. Although obviously they were following the footsteps of those two bands, they very much ploughed their own furrow. They had their own thing going on and made some absolutely terrific records along the way. So formed in 1981 and initially were part of the movement that was generally known as the Paisley Underground, the psychedelic revival movement, vaguely at least, that was coming up in the aftermath of punk. So at the time they were more specifically focused on retro 60s sounds, that nuggets kind of slightly garagey, raw 60s pop, along the lines really of what their contemporaries, the Pandoras, also were doing. So released a couple of singles and stuff, and when they eventually got signed to a major, I think that a lot of that sound kind of carried over into their major label work, but it just got polished up a bit and some 80s production touches get in there. Then you get the more recognizable Bangles sound that the mainstream world finally heard. But yeah, even with the 80s production touches, to have a band that was charting that was so clearly influenced by like the Beatles and by, garage bands and by Big Star and by sort of all manner of 60s folk stuff. I mean, you can hear bits of Fairport Convention in those vocal harmonies, that kind of stuff. So it really stood out against the sort of pop landscape of the early 80s. But they really made it work and actually had some sizable hits. I think it's a shame that several of their best known songs are just covers. Obviously, Manic Monday was written for them by Prince, and War Like an Egyptian was written by Liam Sternberg and had actually been recorded by Lena Lovitch first, although I don't think her version actually came out. But yeah, those biggest successes did come from songs that were written by outside songwriters, which is a shame because their own songs were always terrific. Although they did have a tremendous way with a cover version, as Hazy Shade of Winter, which I think was recorded for the soundtrack to the film of Less Than Zero. I mean, that certainly shows their ability with a cover. Also, notably recorded a tremendous version of September Girls by Big Star, which I urge you to seek out because that's absolutely lovely. And I guess their other best known song would be Eternal Flame, which I know a lot of people kind really hate now just for being a big syrupy power ballad. I believe that the rest of the band, apart from Susanna Hoffs, who co-wrote the song, weren't terribly keen on it at the time. I think they felt, probably with some justification, that it was continuing this process of foregrounding Susanna Hoffs and putting the rest of them kind of as a backing group. I understand any criticisms of it. It does tick off a lot of the cliches of 80s power ballads, but I have a hard time disliking anything that Susanna Hoffs sings. She's just an absolutely wonderful singer, and backed up with those harmonies. I mean, the Peterson sisters, that combination of voices, I think that's one of the key elements of the band's success. And although they split up after the album that Eternal Flame came from, they have since reformed, and it's really nice to see them still occasionally going out and performing, and those harmonies still sound absolutely on point. And Michael Steele, who was the bass player through their successful years, didn't rejoin the band, but they're back with Annette Zelinskas, who was the original bass player, and who I also love from her work as the lead singer of Blood on the Saddle, the great 80s cowpunk band. So it's really cool to see her back in the band as well now. So yeah, a great band, and that version of Hazy Shade of Winter is an absolute killer. They didn't change the arrangement that much from Simon & Garfunkel. I think they cut down the middle eight section a little, beefed up the harmonies a bit, distorted the guitar riff. On the original, the guitar riff's played on an acoustic, and obviously Vicky Peterson gives it some 80s distortion, and it just works brilliantly. But just hearing that distorted guitar riff and thinking about what I could do with the song, I could just hear how, from an 80s rock perspective, the next logical thing to do with that guitar riff would be to add a harmony to it. And that just immediately made me think of Iron Maiden. And then I started to think, if it had an Iron Maiden kind of galloping rhythm section underneath it, this could actually make a great new wave of British heavy metal song. So for this week's alternative universe scenario, I just speculated that there's an alternative universe somewhere where back in the early 80s, instead of hearing the Beatles and garage bands and Big Star and everything, that the Bangles got the spark to start creating music by hearing the first Girls' School record, and came out in Demolition, came out in 1980, I believe. So Girls' School, the great all-female new wave British heavy metal band, who I'm sure did inspire loads of female musicians. So I just speculated that the Bangles were one of those bands who were inspired by that. So they get together, but instead of playing this nice jangly 60s inspired pop music, they're playing this driving British inspired heavy metal instead. And that's how we end up with this version of Hazy Shade of Winter. Because the new wave of British heavy metal definitely would have influenced a lot of LA bands back in the early 80s. If you're not familiar with the whole new wave of British heavy metal movement, or NWOBHM as it's generally awkwardly abbreviated, I guess just that whole wave of bands who emerged from the mid-70s from the UK scene as the sort of first wave of British heavy rock bands were starting to get a bit bloated, run out of ideas, lose momentum. A kind of new wave of young, hungry, stripped down heavy rock bands started to emerge in parallel with the punk rock movement, and taking a lot of that movement's energy as well. So towards the end of the 70s and into the start of the 80s, you start to see records emerging from some of these bands who've been working hard throughout the late 70s, gigging around these little venues, and who've been promoted in newspapers like Sounds. There's a busy tape trading scene, and there are little clubs springing up, notably the Sound House. Yeah, the Heavy Metal Sound House, which is basically a club night set up in a nightclub called the Bandwagon in London by a guy called Neil Kay, and that was one of these places that would just provide a focal point for these young, generally working class kids who've grown up on Black Sabbath and Deep Purple, and then the bands that came after, Budgie, Nazareth, and then American hard rock bands at the time as well, Blue Oyster Cult. And these kind of nights formed rallying points for fans of this music and honed it into a bit of a movement, really. Musically, there's quite a range of different hard rock styles represented. Obviously, some bands coming more from the Deep Purple Rainbow tradition, some more from the doomy, really heavy Sabbath school, some more inspired by the AC/DC sort of riff rock, and then others who had a much more pronounced American hard rock influence. And then, of course, some who had more of a Motorhead influence, Motorhead being a really key influence on a lot of this stuff. The unifying factor, I guess, was that a lot of the more over-the-top, bloated aspects of earlier hard rock bands were stripped away, and it was very much a kind of back-to-basics approach that unified these bands. So no fancy stage outfits, much less bloated arrangements. Keyboards were generally out. It's just often guitar, bass, and drums. denim and leather outfits, and it's just about blood and guts rock and roll rather than any of the pomp and pageantry that had started to surround a lot of these older rock bands. So obviously the most notable bands to emerge from that scene, Iron Maiden, I think, is the band that would always spring to mind first when you mention the new wave of British heavy metal. Def Leppard also emerged from this, although quite quickly gravitated to a more poppy, commercial, radio-friendly sound, whereas Iron Maiden pretty much stuck to their guns. Obviously, they added more prog elements, but that sort of basic hard-driving heavy metal remains in their sound to this day. And then you get other bands. Diamond Head were a great early band in the NWOBHM scene who suffered from an inability to get a record properly released, so by the time they finally got a really well-distributed record out, a few other people had jumped the gun, but they were really impressive and really influential in a lot of the American thrash bands who came afterwards. And there were so many more. There was a series of compilation albums called Metal for Mothers that gathered together a lot of these early bands, bands like Raven and Angel Witch. The Tigers of Pantang from Whitley Bay were a really solid early band. Tank, formed by Algie Ward after he left The Damned, who did a great line in post-Motorhead, slightly punk-tinged metal. There's a lot of great music in there. It's something that's really well worth dipping into if you have an interest in this kind of early British heavy metal. And a lot of the things that people associate with heavy metal, you know, the style of dress, the denim and leather, that biker look that is generally associated with metal, that kind of came in then. The idea of headbanging, that's when that first really cemented with heavy metal too. So although there were metal bands long before this, I think the new wave of British heavy metal is what really cemented the idea of metal in the public consciousness. As I say, it's a really cool, really exciting style of grassroots metal, and that's what I wanted to try and inject into this Bangles version of this Simon & Garfunkel song. So, as I always say, I start out by just taking the isolated vocals, just singing it up to the grid. The first thing to do for this, obviously, was to just speed up the tempo, because you really want to get that galloping, slightly punky energy that you tend to get with a lot of these great early NWOBHM records. Programmed some drums on, did my best to give it a bit of an Iron Maiden gallop. It's quite hard. Wasn't 100% sure how to do it. I listened to a few old records, but both Clive Burr and Nico McBrain, who at time of recording has just retired from Iron Maiden after 42 years, so sorry to see you go, Nico. They both had quite a different way of doing that galloping beat, so I threw in bits of both, and it probably doesn't really sound like either, but it has a bit of that feel to it, I think, at least. And then played on some bass. For about 30 seconds, I attempted to play the bass in an authentic Steve Harris fingerstyle manner. Quickly realised there was no way I was going to be able to do that. It's a hell of a skill, one I don't possess, so just played it with a pick, but I at least kind of tried to give it a bit of that kind of Steve Harris feel. I don't know if I've ever shown you my bass, actually. I show guitars that I've used in some of these videos, but I don't think I've ever mentioned the bass. So the bass on every one of these tracks that I do is this one. It's a Washburn XB100. Which was the cheapest bass I could find on eBay when I decided I needed a bass to record demos. It's incredibly basic, but it's always served me pretty well. I know it probably can't produce authentic sounds for all these different styles that I'm doing, but it does a reasonable job, so I'm quite happy with it. So I've got my bass on there. I decided that to keep things as heavy as I could, as well as the sort of signature guitar riff, I was going to just have some kind of rhythm guitars underneath, just playing chordal stuff. So I put on a stereo pair of rhythm guitars, just playing kind of chuggy palm muted power chords through the verses and ringing power chords through the choruses. Then I put on the signature riff and added a harmony to that, and just on those same tracks just added a few other harmony bits on. There's a line about Hear the Salvation Army Band, where on the Bangles version you've got a kind of synth brass thing, so I just did that as a harmony guitar instead, and threw on a few other bits as well just to give it a bit of that Iron Maiden thing, which I guess in turn was influenced by Thin Lizzy with the kind of twin guitar harmonies. Always really enjoy doing that. And then distorted guitar wise, there's one more which crops up. It throws on a third harmony in a few places, and then over the outro added just like a little bit of solo whittling as well. And then the middle eight section, the Bangles version, it goes very ethereal and floaty, and it's just harmony vocals and I think some synths. So instead of just doing it quite like that, I took the drums to a half-time feel, and there's some more harmony guitars on there, and I threw on just a clean kind of chorusy guitar as well to make everything a bit sort of sparkly and mystical before we go back into the really heavy outro. And that's about it. I think it ticks at least a few of those NWOBHM boxes. I mean, I was mainly just going for Iron Maiden. I didn't try and cover the whole genre because each one of these bands has their own kind of distinctive things going on. So hopefully it sounds a bit Maiden-y and you can see what I was trying to do there. For the video, I found a good TV performance of the Bangles, like where they're really rocking out, which is pretty cool. Mix that in with, there's an old clip of a BBC documentary, I think, about the sort of upcoming wave of metal from the early 80s. Which has some really cool footage from the Heavy Metal Soundhouse Club with an air guitar contest and these metal kids headbanging away, and I thought that's perfect. So I mixed some of that in there as well, along with my standard mocked up concert posters. So hopefully that makes it feel a bit more like a metal performance as well. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed that. Let me know what you think down in the comments if you've got anything to say about it. And next week we go full on Christmassy for a couple of weeks, so look out for that if you're feeling festive. If there's anything else you'd like me to take a look at, any songs you'd like me to try, any artists you'd like me to take a look at, or any styles you'd like me to have a go at, please do let me know as ever. I'm always open to your suggestions. But yeah, otherwise, that's me for this week. So look out for another video landing on Monday. And until then, see you next time.